The PlayStation 2 is best known for its incredible library of games and is often heralded as the greatest system of all time because of this fact, with people still discovering forgotten classics to this very day. This was due to just how experimental gaming was back in the early 2000s. Many developers were out there pushing bold new ideas at the time, and this led to many classics and acclaimed titles being released on the system. When it came to the horror genre, the PS2 really needs no introduction. Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Rule of Rose, Haunting Grounds and many more amazing titles made their place on the PlayStation 2 and is still to this day the best console to experience this genre with. I typically don't like throwing the term Golden Age around often since it can come off as tone deaf, but it's hard to ignore the sheer volume and diverse lineup that this system had when it came to horror. From mainstream titles to cult classics, the 6th generation of horror truly was the golden age when it came to this genre. In this video, we'll be taking a look at a more forgotten release from this time in gaming with Kuon, which released in 2004 and was developed by FromSoftware? FromSoftware. The same developers that made the Soulsborne series, made a horror game. This is going to be interesting. Starting from the beginning, Kuon takes place in Kyoto during the Heian period. When booting the game up for the first time, we're given a choice between our two protagonists. There's the first character, Usuke, whose story is known as the Yin phase, and then there's Kureha, who follows the Yang phase. Similar to Resident Evil 2 with Leon and Claire, both campaigns take place at the exact same time and feature different perspectives on the story to uncover both sides of the main mystery. But unlike that title, playing through both stories is required here to get to the credits and finish the game itself. Getting into the story itself and things are pretty out there. So basically, during the opening of Usuke's story, she arrives at the Fujiwara mansion with her sister to find her dad known as Doman. Kureha at that same time also arrives alongside Doman's disciples to investigate these strange incidents involving some kind of reincarnation ritual with wicker baskets and merging bodies together to create these strange monstrosities of nature. Kureha is more prepared for this kind of thing, whereas Usuke arrives without knowing the horrors that await her within this mansion. A neat small detail with this game is how this is also reflected in the animations between the two, with Usuke being more timid whereas Kureha doesn't hesitate at all when fighting and exploring the unknown horrors of this place. Our two protagonists also bump into each other a few times throughout their stories to help one another out. I can respect the ambition behind Kuon's plot. Similar to FromSoftware's Soulsborne games, things are often kept vague with the player having to fill in the blanks in the narrative. However, unlike those games, I don't feel like I need another person explaining to me what happened to even understand the story on a basic level. By the time you've played through both campaigns, you'll start to piece together the story as a whole. Another aspect I found quite interesting with Kuon is how it also shares similar themes explored in FromSoft's more modern titles such as reincarnation and the supernatural. At times it really reminded me of Sekiro. Things really start to escalate once you connect the dots and figure out what's the cause behind all these strange rituals, and as a whole the narrative was interesting enough to keep me invested to see how this would all tie up in the end. When it comes to the gameplay of Kuon, the general loop towards progression will have you slowly navigating around the Fujiwara mansion to find key items and backtracking to open doors in order to move forwards. Unfortunately, combat seems to be a weaker aspect of this title. Many outlets back in the day gave Kuon pretty harsh review scores because of this. I'm a bit confused however, since when looking at those same reviews today, they seem to be critiquing Kuon's controls, which is a little strange. The controls in Kuon are what you'd expect, being fairly standard for a horror game even today and are responsive as a whole. I think these reviewers are more referring to the actual combat itself when saying this. I just think this is poor wording on their end, since from my playthrough there really wasn't anything off when it came to controlling the characters. Anyway, tangent aside, the actual combat itself is fairly standard. Usuke attacks with a knife whilst Kureha uses her fans when it comes to dealing melee damage. Both characters handle pretty much the same, but Kureha seems to have some pretty bad hitboxes when it comes to her second attack, with it barely ever connecting and landing its mark, which can lead to you getting hit when you might have thought otherwise. The other form of attacks that you can use is magic. They are limited in use but range between summoning allies and firing a type of projectile. I'll try to keep the comparisons to a minimum, but these really reminded me of Soulsborne, especially with the fire arrows and ice shots. The summoning in Kuon is also similar to how it is in Elden Ring, with how allies usually draw aggro from enemies and bosses, allowing you to sit back and deal damage. Some of the summons are a bit strange however. You can summon a literal spider which can immediately get stepped on, which is pretty funny. For a horror title on the PlayStation 2, I actually enjoyed the more mindless and unconventional combat. Unless it was a horror game made by Capcom during this era, the chances were combat was going to be fairly jank and clunky. It's something that fans seem to have embraced over the years and look fondly back on, since there's an argument to be made here that it adds to the horror atmosphere with you not feeling as in control as you should be. I agree with this statement. When the Silent Hill 2 remake was being shown off with all its polish and reimaginings, you often heard this comment with how combat should feel somewhat jank in a horror game, since it's kind of the point. Whether it was intentional or not doesn't really matter when it fits tonally with the game itself. What I find personally bogs down the experience of Kuon isn't the combat, but more to do with just how bad the enemy AI can be. The game advises the player to sneak around and avoid combat, but these enemies are so slow and go down so easily that you can run through the whole game with no situational awareness. Even when they grab you, this doesn't deal any actual damage and you can mash out of it almost immediately. Ghosts go down in just one hit, and you can also run away from any situation and encounters with them de-aggroing you whenever you enter a loading zone. Boss fights also suffer from this same issue when it comes to their AI. Outside of the PS2 Guardian Ape, every boss encounter is a bit too easy for a horror game in my opinion. Especially when it comes to just how generous this title is, with it always giving you more resources than you'll ever need to handle anything that's thrown at you. At the very least, if you're new to this genre, Kuon is actually a pretty decent option when it comes to trying out classic horror titles due to just how easy and forgiving it is. This game also takes a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil when it comes to progression and feels closest to that title with the type of horror experience that's on offer here. The healing in particular feels directly taken from that title when it comes to the lack of UI on screen, with you relying on subtle gestures made by the protagonist to know when to heal up. There's this other mechanic centered around healing as well. When you're spooked by an apparition or some other kind of supernatural phenomena, the game will start to freak out and blur, kinda like a sanity meter in other horror games. During these moments, you're unable to use magic, but if you find a safe spot to pray, you can return to normal. Doing this also heals you to full health, so this mechanic can be somewhat overpowered with this knowledge in mind, and once again trivializes any kind of challenge this game had. The environments in Kuon are genuinely top notch and was what had me the most impressed during my playthrough. Exploring the mansion and reading about the downfall of its citizens with their journal entries that they've left behind is a great bit of world building. The environments also reflect this with its decayed and abandoned atmosphere. Despite other people being on the premises, you still feel very much isolated when exploring this place. Once again, it's very similar to the first Resident Evil game. Moments where you're following a trail of blood to find out where it leads to create some good suspense on a horror level, and it's just one example of how Kuon nails its atmosphere. Similar to Silent Hill 2, the game also knows when you're backtracking and sets up scares to throw you off your guard. I really like when horror games do this since it can be very unpredictable. Even when saving, you're not truly safe since there's a random chance that moments like these can happen. I don't have the footage, but one time when I paused the game for a while and came back, a jump scare appeared when I resumed gameplay, which caught me off guard when it happened. But that begs the question, is Kuon a scary game? This is a subjective question for sure, and it can vary from person to person. In terms of feeling vulnerable, we've already covered how as a survival horror game you never really feel vulnerable due to the enemy AI and generous amounts of resources. However, the game's environments and overall atmosphere carries Kuon when it comes to being a solid horror experience, and is where the game is actually scary in my opinion. The use of sounds and subtle glances both in and outside the cutscenes on top of what we've already looked at really elevates this title into a well-crafted horror game despite some of the issues when it comes to gameplay. There are also some more abrupt scares thrown in, like this one-time instant kill section involving a gorilla, which really freaked me out with how it comes out of nowhere. Graphically, Kuon is top notch, the lighting alongside clothing physics are very impressive for a PlayStation 2 title. Speaking of aesthetics, there really is something about Kuon that really feels on point when it comes to this. The more quiet moments often feel liminal at times, and these loading screens being real world locations also further adds to this vibe. Sometimes, good horror is less about what's on screen and more about what's evoked in our minds when given these barren and desolate locations to peer into. The out there nature of these areas, while still retaining real world architecture, are made for good contrast when it comes to just how bizarre the world of Kuon actually is. It's all pulled off very well here. Other smaller details with Kuon is that it surprisingly has an English dub, considering the fact it's from a game released in 2004 is actually pretty decent.
The worms resting in the cocoon. What could they be thinking? I think I must be dreaming. I must be dreaming a long, long dream.
Similar to Silent Hill 2 with its in-game cutscenes, the characters also speak without moving their lips as a technical limitation, which can make it pretty difficult to tell who's talking on screen at times. Also, post-script and semi-post editing Elliot here, unfortunately I also fell into this trap and accidentally confused the character I've been saying as Kureha is Sakuya. Kureha is Usuki's sister. Apologies for any confusion with this, I will be calling her Sakuya for the remainder of this review. Okay, let's jump back into the video. Characters are pretty stilted when compared to late game PlayStation 2 titles, which better showcase what the system was capable of. But as an early to mid generation game on the system, I would say that cutscene wise things are fairly standard. Before capping off our journey through Kuon, I'd like to add a small little spoiler section. If you would like to avoid spoilers, then please skip to this timestamp on screen. Okay, so things get pretty wild towards this game's ending. It turns out that Do-Man was behind everything. When I said this game's story was pretty out there, I meant it. It turns out that the Mulberry twins, which are actually trees, were using the silkworms and dead humans to merge the two together in order to bring the dead back to life using the wicker baskets as cocoons of sorts. All of this is better explained through the journal entries that you've collected throughout the game at this point. Anyway, Usuki becomes possessed by the Mulberry child and intends to kill Sakuya, and it's here where once you finish both campaigns where the true final story is unlocked. So this character called Seimai pulls up and proceeds to beat the crap out of Do-Man and figures out a way to destroy the remaining Mulberry twin. After being defeated in a last ditch effort, Do-Man fuses with his daughter and enters the wicker basket to become reincarnated. Seimai attempts to destroy the basket, but Sakuya stops her since Usuki is still alive in there. The game ends with Sakuya and the newly reincarnated Usuki leaving the shrine. Will Usuki go the way of her twisted father, or will she carve her own path? Unfortunately, our story ends here on a cliffhanger, which I doubt we'll ever see an answer to. It's a shame playing Kuon today, since with its ambition and cliffhanger ending, it shows that FromSoftware absolutely have plans to follow up this title one day with a sequel. As a big fan of horror, with a second attempt at this kind of game, I feel like the developers would have made a much better experience using the skills and lessons they've learned from the original Kuon. But that's not how this story is supposed to go. We all know at this point what became of FromSoftware after this generation with the PlayStation 3. Whilst this video could carve out a narrative about how their identity has changed due to their mainstream appeal, if anything, I'm just glad to see them find their footing in this industry and become the gaming giant that they are today. FromSoftware might just have one of the most interesting histories of any game studio out there. There seems to be this generalization that anything they made back in the early 2000s that wasn't Armored Core or Kingsfield was shovelware. But Kuon is an interesting footnote in their history as game developers. One day it would be amazing to see them attempt another horror title. As a huge fan of the genre, the idea of a full budget FromSoftware horror entry with all the atmosphere and customization of today would simply be incredible. Moving back to Kuon itself however, it's evident that playing through this game myself that reviews were pretty harsh on Kuon back in the day and affected its ability to make any impact on audiences at the time. When playing this game in the modern day, there really isn't any substitute to these more experimental mid-budget horror titles anymore, which makes Kuon all the more worth checking out because of this fact. Indie titles tend to carry this genre since most notable horror games nowadays seem to be releases from the 5th generation, further proving that that was the golden age of horror. Here's hoping Silent Hill F shakes things up. It's looking very promising so far and seems to be something different compared to all the remakes that we've been getting. Whilst Kuon might not be the most acclaimed horror game on its system, for fans of the genre, if you're willing to look past its shortcomings, it's well worth booting up today. Unfortunately, as is typical for these types of games that never saw a re-release, second-hand copies are fairly pricey online. It's tied with Rule of Rose for being some of the most expensive games on the system. On top of that, Kuon's legacy as a collector's item seems to overshadow any topics regarding the game itself in the modern day. This tends to happen a lot with retro games, where collectors see this hobby less for the experiences they bring and more for the rarity and monetization that they can gain over it, but that's a topic for another day. As is typical in these types of videos, play this game in any way you can. This will never get a re-release on modern systems, and why should you miss out due to its price on the second-hand market? It seems like every horror title on this system is beyond overpriced when it comes to playing them authentically today. We need some modern ports of these forgotten horror classics. When it comes to ranking Kuon among other horror giants on the PlayStation 2, I'd probably put it slightly above Silent Hill 4, but below Clock Tower 3. Narratively, I love Silent Hill 4, but that second half is the most stressed out I've ever felt whilst playing a game, which is why it's so low, but that's a topic for another day. Overall, this has been an interesting footnote when it comes to the history of horror gaming. But now, I'm curious, have you ever played or even heard of this niche title? What are your thoughts on it? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.